Hello and welcome to our Sunfish fishing tips edition of Ask an Angler. So today we're going to be covering all things sunfish. It's that time of year. We're coming up very quickly on the sunfish spawn here. Kind of jumped right from winter into summer. So this last week, water temps, especially in small bodies of water, ponds, small impoundments, things like that. You're going to see rapid water temperatures coming up, which means bass and crappie are going to be spawning kind of simultaneously, and those sunfish are going to be coming in right behind them. So it's a great time of year to get out. Sunfish are kind of an oftentimes overlooked food fish and sport fish, but you take light action tackle out for them, they can really turn a rod over a lot more so than kind of small bass or crappie will give you. So they're a real fun fighting fish. And there's not really a better time of year to catch them than there is right now, because they typically are up very, very shallow. So they're accessible from the banks, no matter if you're fishing in a big reservoir, your local pond, your farm pond, little city lake, things like that. You're going to have fish that have just up in those shallow sheltered waters, either building their beds, they're going to be in and around their bedding area, and you're probably going to see some fish that are kind of actively getting into that spawn. Sunfish are typically your most prolific fish, especially in small bodies of water. So if you have a pond or a small city lake, odds are sunfish make up a majority of the fish that are in there. So their spawning period can take a little bit longer than some of your other species that are in those bodies of water, just because it takes them there's so many of them, and they're trying to go through that process, that you'll have fish probably spawning right now. That peak will be coming up here in the next couple of weeks, and then you'll see fish spawning all the way into June, just depending on when they get the opportunity to do so. And in smaller bodies of water, if there's only a handful of ideal spawning habitat in that pond, then they're just going to be kind of working that area for the next 4 to 6 weeks until they can finish that cycle. So it's a great time to get out there and get after them. And the great thing about sun fishing is you can make it as complex as you'd like, depending on how you like to fish. If you want to throw artificial baits, soft plastics, hard lures, or even fly fish for them, it's a great time of year to really, if you're into fly fishing or anything like that, 10 car, really good time of year to kind of wet your whistle on getting some confidence with the fly rod catching sunfish, because you can catch them up on the surface with dry flies, terrestrial patterns, and then you can also catch them strip in little bugs. You can just strip in little bead head, rubber leg, or you can just float a nymph below a bobber. And typically with sunfish, it's just put something that looks like food and in front of them, and they're going to take it. So we'll kind of go through all of the different setups that you might find yourself needing if you're sun fishing. But for all intents and purposes, there's really only one setup that you ever need to know to sunfish, especially at this time of year when they're in that shallow water. And that's going to be a small hook, a bobber, and a piece of bait. Typically your bait, I like to use crappie nibbles. So crappie nibbles, they come in a little can. This is one of the smaller versions. They make a size that's about this much, about twice the size. But these are great. I love crappie nibbles. This is my favorite color. It's called Chrome Glow. It's just a chartreuse power bait, and just says crappie nibbles right there on it. And usually it's listed right here, Chrome Glow. It just puts off a little bit of a glow in the water, kind of like a glow bait or a glow jig head. So if you're in stained water, it just kind of adds just a little bit extra for them to kind of get a visual on top of the scent that comes off of this. But these are great because, unlike worms, you don't get anything on your hands. You don't have to refrigerate them. You can just store these in your car, your bag, your tackle box, in your garage, wherever. They keep really well as long as you keep the lid on them. So once you take usually there's a piece of film that comes over the top, a little tin film, and you pull that off. But once you pull that off, as long as you keep the lid closed on it, you're really going to be able to keep these for up to a couple of years before they start to dry out on you. So I love crappie nibbles, but a basic cup of worms, I prefer red worms over night crawlers. They're a little bit smaller worms. So when you're going, and you don't need to put an entire worm onto a hook. So just pinching off a little portion. A lot of times the size hooks that we're using are so small that the diameter of a night crawler is just big enough that sometimes when you get it on that hook, you don't get a good hook set into the fish because you actually can't break through the meatiness of that night crawler, if that makes any sense. You're not getting enough hook point to come through into the fish. So what ends up happening is you can kind of feel that tension for a second while the hook point's trying to make contact, and it'll actually just kind of scrape the roof of their mouth and come right out their mouth. So I got a setup right here already. So this is kind of my Panfish Crappie Rod. It's just a 6-foot light action rod. It's a 2-piecer, so can break down nicely. It can fit in a backpack and fit in a car. This is a great setup, but you can go all the way up to a medium action. Just basic rod is going to be fine. But if you really want to play the fish, I have 4-pound fluorocarbon test on this, and this is my hook. So the hook that I have on here, this is a very small hook. This is going to be more of a trout hook. It's a short shank, wide gap hook that's typically used for trout. It's going to be a size 16, so it's a very small hook. But I like that because if I put a crappie nibble on this, it gets inhaled every time. If I put a little bit of a worm on there, we can use maybe a piece of soft plastic here for an example. But let's say that I'm going to rip the tail off of a soft plastic here, but let's say that this was your worm and you had just your little piece of nightcrawler or red worm. What you don't want to do with sunfish is give them a lot to peck at, because they come in quick. They're a prey species for so many other fish in every body of water that you're fishing. They don't like to get away from their group. They don't like to come away from either the shallow sheltered water that they think they have cover in. So they come in and quick strike. So what happens is if you put your worm on your hook and it looks something like this with your little worm that you got on there, if this was natural bait, if this was our little piece of red worm or night crawler, you can see how much is hanging off of the end of the hook. And what'll end up happening is they'll come up and they can grab this, and your bobber will go underwater, and you never feel tension, because all they're doing is you're giving them too much tag end that they just rip that. And if this wasn't an artificial plastic, I'd rip it right off of the hook. So when you do put a worm on, you really just need enough to get up over that hook point. So for something like this is a little long, so I'm going to cut it. You want to just make sure that little bit of hanging piece of tail that you got over the end is no more than 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch past your hook point, or else you're just going to be dealing with getting bites all day long and not a lot of hookup success, because they're just going to take the bait right from you. And what I'll do is when I get my piece of worm started on my hook point, I'll just take one end. Usually I'll take a whole worm and I'll just start on one end and I'll put it on that hook point, and then I'll work it up the hook shank, wrap the worm around, and then I will put it one more time through the hook point. And so you'll end up with something that looks like this, where the little bit of hanging tag end that we got off of our hook point isn't so severe that if they grab that, they're more than likely to pull the rest of the hook in with them, because you just don't give them enough to get it off. Now, if you're ever in the need to catch bait, use sunfish as bait. A lot of times old soft plastics that you got laying around that maybe you busted the guts out of your catching crappie or whatever, and it no longer stays on a jig head, they're good to hang on to, because this right here, just that tail right there, and then maybe add a crappie nibble onto the hook point just for a little something extra. This will catch sunfish all day long with just the tail end of a brightly colored worm, or little tag end of a baby shad swim bait, anything that you got lying around that produces a curly tail grub, just something that's got a tail on it. You can just pinch off the bottom part of that plastic when you've ruined maybe the guts of the bait and it just won't hold onto a hook anymore. And you can use something just like this. This is what I used to do a lot. If we couldn't find a bait shop, maybe we're fishing a dam, riprap, just trying to get some bait to use for like flatheads or bass or anything like that. And this is all we'd use. It's just using something like that. And you'd be amazed at how many fish you will catch along riprap in your pond just using a small piece of soft plastic. But the most ideal way to catch fish, especially if you're new to the sport, just trying to get your feet wet with catching some fish, get that confidence up, taking a kid, taking somebody new fishing and you want them to have success, just some crappie nibbles or a cup of worm. And nothing fancy with the crappie nibble. Looks just something like this. And what I would do is you just take that hook point, center it up on the hook point, and then just push it down to the turn. And it just sits just like that on the hook point. And that's all you need. You can put a piece of split shot on your line. If you need your bobber to stand up. I like stick bobbers as opposed to your round bobbers, you know, something like this. Even this, so this one right here is a normal size, kind of average size round bobber. This is going to be on that smaller end. But even this right here provides so much resistance that sometimes that's okay with sunfish. Because if they can come up and you got your bait, especially if you're using a crappie nibble, if they want that crappie nibble, they got to take the hook. So they can eventually peck it off. But the first time your bobber goes under, that entire hook is going to be in the fish's mouth. So if you use a round bobber, one of these average size ones, what will happen a lot of times is just that tension is enough to set the hook for you. But I really prefer a stick bobber, something like this, something like this, where we have our little line holding. These are just a lot easier because you can just slide it up and put that right on the line. If you're using real small tests, like 4-pound tests like this, sometimes they'll have, does this one have it? Some of them, they'll have a double clip in there. And the first clip is to be a slip float. The second clip is what actually fixes it to the line. But what you can do is if you're having trouble holding this on the line when you get it on there, this one is nice and tight. This is a real good clip. But this one right here is not. So it doesn't have a lot of tension to hold that line. So what you end up having to do is just wrap it once around. So this one, I already had it done to it. But if you ever feel like you go to cast, and what will happen if something like this isn't tight on the line, you'll go to cast. And by the time you hit the water, you'll notice that your bobber is like right here by your bait. And at this time of year, you really only need it to be about a foot above. If that, sometimes I'll only run it. If I'm fishing really shallow water, especially when they're up on beds, I might only have it about 6 or 8 inches above because that's enough. They don't even care about the bobber when it hits the water. They're so aggressively feeding. But if you do get one like this, that it can move up and down the line like this without any tension, that's not going to be good because the tension when you go to cast it, it's going to throw it right down to your hook. So all you have to do with these when you run into that situation, because this bobber will hold like 8 or 10-pound test, no problem. It's just because the line diameter on 4-pound test is so small. So what you do is take the end that goes to your hook and then just wrap it around the bobber and then run it back into that deal and then let it clip down. And now it doesn't move. So you just wrap it once. I prefer not to do that because it will put a little bit of fray in your line. So if you do it, you're kind of set to, you can't really move your bobber around, because if you do, you're going to have lots of frays in the line, which if you hook into a big fish and you're using 4-pound test, it's probably going to snap it up here by your bobber, not down on your hook point. But something to pay attention to when you're out there. But I really like stick bobbers. They really don't need much in the way of a bite to pull them under. And at this time of year, because fish are so aggressive, I won't even bother putting a piece of split shot on here, because what happens is they'll bite the split shot. They're just so aggressive. They see something that's swinging there. So they'll come over and grab the split shot. And because bites are so fast and furious at this time of year, I don't need the bobber to stand up. So really what that weight is doing when you're using a stick bobber is, if it doesn't have any weight, this hook and piece of crappie nibble isn't heavy enough to actually stand this bobber up without some weight. So I'll just land it on the water like this. And once they come hit it, the bobber will stand up, or from this position, it'll just shoot straight under. but completely up to what your comfort level is of identifying bites. But this is the only setup you'll ever need to go sun fishing. It's just some small bobbers, a couple pieces of split shot, just some small to medium sized split shot, less than an eighth of an ounce, like 16th ounce, 1/32 ounce pieces of split shot. And if you wanted to put it on the line, I would keep it a little bit a ways away from the hook at this time of year because, like I said, they will come and they'll bite this piece of split shot on the line. Um, so I don't want, if I do put split shot on, I don't want it moving up and down the line. So when you secure it on there, make sure you take like some pliers or some vice grips or something that you use just so you can really pinch that down on the line. You don't want it. You, if just a little bit of tension, you shouldn't be able to move it. Now it will eventually start to move up and down the line as you get bites and just some wear and tear. Um, but that's about what you're looking for. About 6 inches, 5 to 6 inches up above your hook, and then you'd put the bobber another 6 to 8 inches, a foot up above your split shot. And that's all you'll ever need to go sun fishing. You can take that at this time of year all summer long while those fish are up shallow. You're really just trying to identify congregation areas, which in small bodies of water, like a pond or even a small lake, those are going to be the sheltered sides of the water. So maybe they're up against the dam. There's a shallow cove or bay that runs along it. Anything that comes out of the main channel, if it's not just a completely dug out circle pond, there's typically a river channel or creek channel that was originally dammed. So anywhere off of that up into protected water. So areas that have points that come out, usually both sides of the point are good right up against the bank because they'll get some wind to help aerate the eggs, especially in uh, ponds that get silted in. They don't have good spawning success if they can't get down to hard or sandy substrate where the eggs don't get suffocated. So that's what those male fish are doing once the females come in and lay their eggs is the males will make the bed, and then once the female lays her eggs and he fertilizes them, all they're doing when you catch fish and you notice that the tail fin has a bunch of nicks and cuts and it kind of looks raggedy at this time of year, that's because the male is fanning the bed. So he's hitting it into rocks and debris and sticks in the bottom, just trying to keep oxygen and keep the eggs aerated. But what you're looking for when you're looking for bedding areas is those types of areas, points, coves, anything that's really kind of a flat, where you have gradual depth change. It's not an immediate drop. They like to get up on those flats to build the beds. And in bigger water and reservoirs, lakes, you're going to find those areas in similar places, but they might be a little bit farther off the bank. They might not be right on the bank. And that's for a handful of different reasons, for predation, all different factors. But in ideal spawning habitat in bigger water, they're usually going to spawn a little bit of ways from the bank, not what you would see in a pond. In a pond, they might be right at the water's edge building those beds, and all their beds are going to be about this big around. So soccer ball to basketball size, and you will see them clumped together. In a pond that or a body of water that doesn't have a lot of sunfish in one area, you might see 3 to 10 beds in a kind of a tight formation. And what happens is when they're wringing out those beds and trying to get rid of all the silt, you're going to kind of see a darker area in the middle, which is exposed rocks, twigs, sand, whatever, to lay their eggs on. And then you'll see that kind of softer light color around it where they've really kind of dug in the bed. And that's just kind of the ridges out around them. But typically those beds are going to be right on each other. So each ring is going to lead into another ring, and that's just for protection. When they're spawning, they can come in good numbers, try to defend those beds from bass and crappie and catfish that'll come in and try to eat the eggs and the fry. So that's what you're looking for. And when you see that, at this time of year, there's probably going to be a bunch of fish on it. Now, most of the time in most ponds and smaller lakes, you're going to see those bedding areas where there are beds by the tens, if not hundreds, especially if there's not very many good spawning habitat areas. They really like to cluster spawn. So they find a good spot that they like, and the majority of those fish will come to that spawning area for protection. They can the more numbers they get in there, the more advantageous it is for them to happen to spawn, more chances to spawn, more partners, things like that. But it also groups them together so that they can really protect those bedding areas from bass that are going to work the edges. So while you are getting into sunfish at this time of year, if you're into bass fishing, it's a great time of year. If you catch a little small sunfish, like a 3 to 6 incher, have another rod with you that's rigged up with maybe like a bigger octopus hook or something where you can put that hook right through the bluegill's back behind its dorsal fin and toss it out maybe 10 to 20 feet past the bedding area. And don't be shocked if there's not a big old bass waiting for that, because those bass will just start kind of cruising the edges of those bedding areas. And then especially in the early morning hours, late evening hours, right around dawn and dusk, you'll really see a lot of activity near those beds of bass coming in to try to get an easy meal. So usually during the middle of the day is the best time to catch sunfish at this time of year, because they are in super shallow water. Typically, those bigger predators they'll sink themselves back out. They may be very nearby on a ledge or a drop off, but they'll typically be a little bit away from those beds during the middle of the day. So that's a really good time to stack up fish. And if you're looking to clean fish, if you want to eat them, it's just like cleaning crappie. It's going to be the same exact thing. You go in right behind the gill plate, down to the backbone, turn your knife, go down to the tail, leaving the skin attached to the tail when you get down to basically where the fan is at. And you can flip that fillet over, then run your knife on the table side flat, and that will skin it, and you'll have a skinless fillet. And then you just have to cut the rib cage out, because that'll be attached and it'll be about that big, and you just cut around that, and then you have nice fillet that's about this. There's no limit on bluegill, so unlike crappie where you have to stop at 37 if you're by yourself, which at this time of year you can do that in a pond, but they're usually going to be around maybe just a shade bigger than some of the sunfish. But typically a lot of the crappie that you're going to be cleaning out of a pond are oftentimes a little bit smaller, especially on the fillet side, because those bluegill, once they start to get to about 8 inches, they start to get the shoulders on them. That fillet gets a little bit thicker. Crappie really got to get to about 11, 12, 13 inches to start getting those shoulders on them that give that more of a thick fillet than something like that, more of a quarter, 1/8 inch fillet. You start getting more up into the quarter to half-inch type fillet when you get to those bigger fish. So sunfish are a great fish to clean, especially bluegill. Pure blues, pure reds, they're hybrids. Fish that are over 8 inches are going to make a great meal, and you can keep 50, 60, 70, 80 of them. And right when you're around that 8 inches, and you'll be shocked that if you filled up a bag of 37 bluegill versus 37 pond crappie, a lot of times you got a bunch more meat in that sunfish bag than you do in your crappie bag. Uh, you have a favorite way to cook sunfish? So all of the panfish, really almost all the fish that I catch outside of catfish, I usually pan sear or kind of loosely fry, but I don't put any breading on them, and I'll just make tacos. So when I get my fillets, and this is important with any fish you catch, depending on what your tolerance is for gaminess, leach them. So when you get them back home, I'll clean my fish at the water. I don't have a cleaning station at my house where I can compost the fish. So I'll clean them at the water. So I'll fill up my Ziploc with my fillets. And then when I get home, if there's anything left, typically on sunfish, crappie, there's not really any red meat on them. So I don't have to do additional kind of shaving like I will on a striper or a white bass or a hybrid striped bass. It's just a nice, clean white meat fillet. So I will make sure feel around that you've gotten the rib cages all the way out. Sometimes on those bigger fish, there might be a couple of bones. So you can feel that, but I just run them under cold water, take all the film off of them, and then I'll just soak them in some salt water for a couple hours if I have the opportunity to, but usually it doesn't take me more than 45 minutes to an hour. Just let them sit in that water and then rinse them under cold water again, and then pat them dry and then cook them however you like. But you get a pretty good fillet on them, so you can bread them, usually just like Louisiana fish fry. You don't need to flour an egg or anything like that. Just get a 99-cent bag of Louisiana fish fry, dump that into a sack, or if you have a shaker, and then just throw those fillets in there and shake them up, and you can toss those right into oil, and you'll get nice little nuggets. And with that, when you're not like putting flour or egg or anything to get a thicker crust on them. That Louisiana fry works great because it's almost no breading. It just kind of coats it. So that's a good way to cook them. But typically I'll just blacken them in a pan to make tacos. So put them into a cast iron skillet or just a basic nonstick pan with some butter, some salt and pepper, and then some Cajun seasonings, and just wait and leave them. Put them down on one side, fill the pan up, try to separate them so they're not on top of each other, and then let them cook for a couple minutes on medium high heat. They'll start to get that opaque on one side and a little pink on the top, and then flip them. And then from there, however you like them, I'll usually kind of push the spatula into them to break them up a little bit, so you get more of a kind of flaky, almost like a ground meat but ground fish, and it'll flake. And then I put that in the tacos. And that's how I cook them. But you can't go wrong. You can throw them on the grill if you get some bigger fillets. You can fry them, but I typically pan sear them, and that's how I cook them. And again, these courses are meant to be conversational. So if at any point you have any questions about where to fish, what I'm talking about, random question, throw it in the chat bar and we'll address them as we go along. So you don't have to wait till the end to remember something to ask a question. But that pretty much covers it for bait. You can use this same setup and put a small casting sinker. So this is a real small one. This is going to be like a 16th ounce. And what's great about casting sinkers is they got a pretty good eye hole on them, and these little hooks. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to cut your line to retie your hook on. So if you're not getting bites off of the top, and maybe you want to try bottom fishing for them and casting out a little bit deeper, you just take a small casting weight and it'll go right over the hook point, and then it'll come up your line, and then you just secure it to the line with a piece of split shot. So if you're using a worm or even a crappie nibble, it's not going to float. It'll be right down there on the bottom. So you really only need to give yourself maybe a foot from where you put that split shot. And then again, so we don't have our weight moving up and down, you'll just want to secure that split shot to the line. But that gives you another option to fish for panfish. And sometimes earlier in the year, before the bigger fish start to push up into those shallow waters, once you find bedding area for sunfish on a body of water, unless there's something drastic that's happened year to year, maybe massive flooding or massive drought, where those beds are no longer in kind of a safety zone, they might be too deep because of flooding, or they're no longer in the water because of drought or drawdown, you can usually go back to the same places. And those fish are going to be typically in the same area. So even on big bodies of water, they might be in a cove, and they'll suck out into the middle of that cove, especially if there's any type of cover for them out there. If there's maybe a brush row or some submerged timber, anything like that. They're such a heavily preyed upon species by so many different fish in the water that they typically don't go very far from where their spawning area is throughout the course of the year. They're not going to be like a bass or a crappie that might go way out into the main lake to seek refuge for thermocline and feeding, anything like that. Bluegill, they're omnivores. They eat a lot of different types of food, bugs, insects, terrestrials that they can fit, little small frogs, tadpoles, little crayfish, anything they can fit in their mouth. They're going to be opportunistic feeders. So typically they don't have to go too far away from kind of a home area throughout the course of the year to find food. But at this time of year, they're going to be way up shallow. When you fish for them early in the year, March, April, February, and then again in kind of the fall later as we get into going into winter, they might suck out into deeper water. But they're typically usually associated with like grass flats. And then if you have stumps around grass flats, those are really good hiding areas for sunfish when they can kind of sit down. And it doesn't take much, just a little bit of moss, a little bit of grass, something that's up off the bottom that they can sit down in. And then if you add any type of tree stumps or boulders in those types of areas, those are always going to be good sunfish holding areas. But for the purpose of this course, they're up on the bank right now. So your biggest fish are still going to be, they're going to be not much farther out if they're not up there with them. And, when I say a big fish, a trophy sunfish is 12 inches. You hit a 12-inch sunfish, that is a trophy fish. But really anything over 10 inches is a trophy fish. You're really, you're good. If you can have a really good day of sunfishing, especially if you're looking to clean fish, that 8 to 10 inch range is perfect. Those fish aren't that old. So they have, less chemicals, mercury, everything else in them. So they're better to eat. Sunfish, when they start to get really big, they're long lived. And you might not think about that, but if that's a concern of yours of, what am I eating? What's in these fish? The bigger these fish get and the older they are, the more fish that they can predate upon. That's when you start to see the chemical signatures that are in their body get elevated. So that 8 to 10 inch range is like a perfect, pretty healthy range to keep fish. And it's good for the population, especially if you're in a pond or a small lake. If you get too many sunfish, they start getting in that 6 to 10 inch range. They'll outcompete each other. So what you'll start seeing is kind of just a bunch of fish stuck on 7 inches over time. So if you can clean out, especially if it's your pond, if it's a neighborhood pond, city pond, if you can do your part to help kind of thin the herd. Same thing goes with crappie, of pulling fish out that are in that 8 to 10 inch range. An electric fillet knife goes a long ways, especially the ones they make now. You can plug them right into the AV jack, your cigarette lighter in your vehicle, and you can fillet them right. It's a long enough cord that it gets to your tailgate or your table, and you can fillet the fish right there. And an electric knife goes, it's amazing the difference between using just like a straight fixed blade, like a Bubba blade, even if it's sharp, and trying to clean those fish over and over again, as opposed to having an electric knife. Then all of a sudden having 50, 60, 70 fish to clean, you do it in 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how fast you are at cleaning them. And it makes you want to go catch them and clean them when it becomes easy like that. So if you're still cleaning fish with a fixed blade, and one of the knocks is, man, I just don't know if I want to clean this many fish because it's going to take me a while, you might think about investing in, and they're not overly expensive these days. And you don't need one of the ion battery ones, just a basic Berkeley power cord. They give you a few different options where you can charge them, or you can run the cord straight into a wall outlet or into a truck or car cigarette lighter. Those are great. They travel well. Blades work great for sunfish. So that kind of is your bait version of sunfishing. And that's really all you need. You don't need anything more than that. That's going to catch probably more fish than you will with artificials in most instances. And when I say most instances, that just, if the fishing is so good that you can catch them on little tubes or grubs, you would be catching them just as rapidly if you were using bait. It's just that time of year where you can throw artificials and get a really good sunfish bite. And the only other real bait that you might think about using that you don't need to buy is grasshoppers, crickets, things that you just find along the banks of a lake or a pond. Grasshoppers are great. You just put one on a hook just like this and drop them down, and that will catch some of your bigger sunfish, especially if you can get it past some of the little ones. So if you're targeting bedding areas and you have a grasshopper on, or maybe you have a piece of worm on, or some type of bait that isn't a crappie nibble, you throw it out just a little bit past the bedding area that typically leads to deeper water. Maybe move your bobber up a few inches to maybe get you to 2 feet instead of a foot, and try casting just beyond the bedding zones and see if you can't find some of the bigger fish that have either not pushed up to spawn or have spawned and are now kind of back in that transition zone just looking to feed. But oftentimes at this time of year, your biggest fish are mixed in with your smallest fish, and they're all kind of in the same area, and just casting right into the middle of them over and over and over again. It's really not uncommon to get into 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 fish in, basically every cast when it's hitting the water. So the biggest thing when you get out there is just identifying good habitat for them. And if you have a pair of polarized sunglasses, that's even better, because most of the time at this time of year, even in stained water that maybe only has a foot or two of visibility, you're still going to be able to see them. A lot of times they're just right up on the surface above those bedding areas. If you don't know what to look for, maybe you show up to a pond, you've never been there, just stand on the bank, especially if you can see the whole pond, and look to see if you see swirls, because when they really get up onto those bedding areas, there's just a ton of activity that's going on. So it's really noticeable on the surface. You're just going to see swirls and pops and rings and V's all kind of in the same area. And it's just going to be doing like this. And then in the early morning and evening hours, a lot of times you'll see a big wave come through, and that's just a bass that's moving right through those beds, grabbing something and heading right back out. So that's really what you're looking for to identify water when you go to a new body of water. Sun fishing is best done for for big numbers of fish, typically on smaller bodies of water, ponds, creeks, small city lakes. So, like a Guthrie or a Liberty or a Chandler or a Bell Cow, kind of that's about as big of a lake as you're looking at to really still be able to get into pretty prolific numbers of fish. You start getting out on your bigger reservoirs, then it becomes, unless you know where you're going, that's more of a trial and error, because you really have to locate where those fish are at this time of year. How deep are they? When you're in big water, water depth is relative. So in a pond that's only 12 feet deep, 2 feet shallow, but in a reservoir that's 80 feet deep, 15 feet might be shallow for those fish to come up and look to spawn, especially if they have a nice flat and a marina, protected backwater, anything like that. So when you're on that bigger water, you might not have the luxury of seeing fish right up on a bank. So if you're at a reservoir, usually state park areas, public access areas, marinas, areas that usually have kind of sheltered water because there's a boat ramp or a fishing jetty that comes out to block some of those waves. Those are the areas you want to look at first, because they want that shallow, sheltered, protected water to spawn in. So if you're on the big water, those are kind of the places that you really want to look to first. Now, if you have like a culvert that goes under maybe a highway or a road that takes main lake water into a back area, and there's a right of way where you can park your vehicle and you can fish that backwater, those are good areas to look as well, because those fish will push through the culverts and they'll take advantage of that shallow, protected water that's typically away from predators. And then those are good places to target again in the overnight hours, especially on the culverts, for saugeye, walleye, catfish, bass that are looking to go back into those spawning areas and find fish to eat. So usually at this time of year, you're finding sunfish. You fish it in the mornings and the evenings, you can get a lot of good multi-fish action going, especially if you have 2 rods going. But you could also just have your basic. So here's just a basic spin cast model. This is what we use at our fishing clinics for the most part. You're going to see a lot of different models, but this is kind of Zebco's basic model, Zebco 33, little 5'6" or a 6. This is a 6 foot medium action rod. This is plenty. This is going to be able to hold on to anything. And these are typically spooled. They come spooled with line on them. Usually somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds is your standard. That's plenty of line. You're not going to get broken off with this by sunfish. You start using your light action rod like this one that's got 4-pound test. A good knot and a good drag, or a pound and a half, three-quarter pound up to a pound and a half sunfish can break your line fairly easily if you do not have your drag set. And a lot of times, if you have your drag set real nice, they are so powerful when they turn sideways on you, especially on a light action rod, that they can get you wrapped up in all types of stuff, and you're using light line. So really important, if you're going to use light line to catch fish, you're targeting them in an area where you know where your trouble spots are. So when that bobber goes underwater, you're ready to fork them one way quickly, because the second they can turn sideways and away from you, they really have a lot more power than you'd ever guess, especially on those bigger fish. The ones that are hard to palm, start getting in that 8 to 10, 11-inch area. Those fish have quite a bit of power on them. But something like this, if you just bought this at a Walmart, a bait shop, a Academy, any retailer that sells fishing equipment, and it comes out of the box just like this, you're up and running in a couple of minutes to get fishing, because all you need is some small hooks, split shot, and bobber. Now, the one that I showed on my light action rod is a trout hook. It's very small, it's short shank, but years and years of practice, I don't have any problems getting the hook out of them. Now, if you are sunfishing, you plan on catching and releasing, or you need to throw them in a live well or a bait bucket, you really don't want them dead too quickly, especially, you throw them in a bucket on the side of a pond or a lake and it's not aerated, they're going to die in there. But you really want to keep them alive for as long as possible, especially in these warmer temperatures. You don't want them dead and then, then you start worrying about the meat. How long has it been sitting in there? So whether or not you plan to release or keep them, these are pliers, these are forceps. Get a pair of forceps, because even on big sunfish, unless it's a hybrid sunfish that takes on more of that green sunfish mouth, so it might get maybe that big, most of your bluegill, even big ones' mouths, only going to be about that big. Well, that's just enough room to get this in. But you try to get pliers in that, I mean, if it's open and I can't even get it in there, and then you're having to work it in like that and find your hook and pull it out, more than likely you're going to do some fatal damage to that fish, whether you're pulling out a gill, anything like that. So forceps are great for sunfish, just for the sheer sake that you can get them into the fish's small mouth and do the least amount of damage. But if you're not comfortable with getting hooks out and you want something to hold on to, look to get yourself an Aberdeen hook. It's a long shank hook. This is a size 6. So a size 6 in comparison to our size 16 trout hook, not a huge difference in our hook point size and our gap. So get that turned. Really not a huge difference, almost identical, really. But with this, you're getting an extra 1/2 inch of shank, which if you're getting good hook sets early on the fish, that means it's probably right either in this corner, or straight out the mouth. And when that happens, all you do is just grab your hook when it's in the fish's mouth, if you're not using pliers. And when they're in there, they can get some tough film and you can get it into spots where it feels like it's not just popping out. But all you got to do is grab the eyelid. And all you want to do is wherever that hook is at, push it towards where the hook is. So if the hook's on the top like that, all you're looking to do is just turn that hook down like that and then pop it. And you can do that. But it gives you a little bit more option to grab onto something than this does when it's in a fish's mouth. Because if I get a good hook set, I'm only going to be able to see just about that eyelid coming out of the fish's mouth. So I don't really have a whole lot to work with of getting that out. But like I said, the more comfortable, the more hooks you take out of fish's mouth, you're going to tailor your setup to what you feel is the most advantageous to catching fish. And I just like a hook that when I put my bait on it, when that fish decides to take that offering, it's getting all of it. There's no way that it can get the bait without getting the hook. So when you start using just a little bit longer of a hook shank, maybe you got some worm that's come all the way up the hook shank that's up here, you got some down hanging off here. There's just lots of places for fish to be able to peck at that worm without ever getting that hook point in their mouth. So I just try to make it to where the fish don't really have a whole lot of options. But you got 2 options when you take your, or the 2 best options when you get your line. So you bought your rod, or you've got your rod already. You've taken your spool, you take your line, you've threaded it through your eye guides. So now you're ready to tie your hook on. Well, again, the great thing about whether or not you want to fish off the top with the bobber or fish off the bottom with weight, it doesn't matter, because we can just tie on straight ahead. We're not using swivels. You should never have to retie on your hook unless a fish breaks you off. So whatever knot you're comfortable with, even these smaller size 6 Aberdeen hooks and 8 to 10 pound test, you can still double that line over and do a Palomar knot, which is the easiest of the fishing knots to tie. And you just work that doubled over end through the eye guide. And then all you're doing is an overhand knot. So it doesn't get any easier tying a fishing knot than a Palomar, which is why it's a great knot. It's a great knot for braid. Really great knot for braid. But for anything else, if you can double over your line and get it through, then all you got to do is just put your hook through that loop, pull that loop up over the rest of the tag end, and then wet your line and then just cinch it down. Easiest knot there is to tie. It's not as strong as an improved clinch knot. But with sunfish, and especially if you're using anything more, if you're using 8 pound test and above, you don't have to worry. You're not getting broken off with that, not by a sunfish. 6 pound test, maybe, depending on your drag and what type of line it is, how many frays are in it. 4 pound test, definitely. They have enough power on that first run where they can snap you off. If the eyelid is too small to double over the line and get it through, you can still do a Palomar knot. You just have to put your line through that eye guide first, bring enough tag end through so you have enough when you double it over, and then just take the end of that tag and go right back through the eye hole the way that you came, the opposite way of the way you came in, and then you can just thread it back on. And then same deal, just an overhand loop of the line, which is going to create a circle and a loop. And then you just push the hook through the loop, pull the loop up over the circle, making sure that the tag end and the main line are still above all of that. If you let them get below, you can end up with not as strong of a knot. And then you just cinch it down. So nothing easier than that to get you up and running for sunfish. And then you can either put your piece of split shot on and then take whatever your preferred bobber is. Again, I love stick bobbers. Put that on your line. Typically no more than about a foot above at this time of year, because you don't want it on the bottom. The sunfish especially are willing to come up and get bait. And when they're in that shallow water and they're spawning, they're usually not in more, especially in the smaller bodies of water, ponds, city lakes. They're usually in no more than about 4 feet of water. Typically they're up in a foot to 2 feet of water. So you only need to be about 6 inches below the surface and they will come up for that, which is why it's a great time of year to throw like little fly fishing poppers. Usually the poppers that they sell to throw on traditional spinning or spin casting or casting reels and rods, they're just a little bit too big. It's not that you can't get hooked up because there's so many trebles that if they hit it in the wrong spot, they can grab one of those treble hooks, but it's really more advantageous to fly fish on the top for them at this time of year. Just, I mean, really anything, especially if you're around trees. If you got a bunch of like maybe reeds or cattails, tall grass, anything where bugs can just get blown off with the wind into the water. There's not a whole lot of patterns that aren't going to work for you if you're fly fishing. Could be little elk hair caddis. Keep them small, like usually size 14 to 16 is a really good size dry fly for panfish. But you can throw hoppers, ants, stimulators, and then mayflies, caddis flies. But they're usually they're not spending a whole lot of time like a trout might thinking is it the hatch. They're just going to come up and hit what's on the surface. So really good time of year to fly fish, especially on the top. And throwing it right on top of those beds, you'll get fish that'll come up and hit it all day long, which is pretty fun because you can use little 3 weights, little light action fly gear. And then your other knot, which is going to be your stronger knot, is going to be your improved clinch knot. So an improved clinch knot, we're just taking the line through, and then we're going to run it up the line. You want to leave about 6 to 8 inches of tag, just so you have enough, especially with with smaller pound tests like 4 and 6 pound, your line is really light, so it twists easy. But when you start getting into 8 and 10 pound and you're trying to tie an improved clinch knot, this line has a tendency to start to get the memory and it'll fight against you. So making sure you got at least 3 to 4 inches of tag beyond where you're twisting. So when you pull it straight through to double it over, you've got at least 8 inches. And then all you're going to do is you're going to twist it 5 to 7 times around. And we've created, try to get that to where we can see it. Right here at the eye guide, you can see there's that little opening that we've made, that little loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our tag end and we're going to feed our tag end through that loop. And then once we've got it through, we've created a new circle. And we're just going to run the tag end through that circle. And again, see, I didn't give myself quite enough tag so that it starts to fight against you. But just find your tag end, and once you're through, it should look like this. And all you're going to do is hold that line just like this with some tension, and the main line is down here in your ring and pinky finger, and then wet the line really good. And then all you're going to do is just pull the main line away, and it'll cinch that knot right down. And on that thicker line, you may just want to give that tag end a little bit of a pull. And then if it's up like that, where it's not quite cinched all the way down, you can just take your fingers above it and just kind of work it on there. But that's a really, really strong knot, especially on 8 and 10 pound test. You're gonna straighten this hook out before you break that knot. So those are the two basic knots to tie and the setups for panfish. And if you can do that, you can go anywhere. You can go anywhere in this state right now and catch fish. And if you can find them, if you can find bedding areas, odds are you're going to catch more fish than you know what to do with. You're just going to be catching them one after another, after another, after another. And when you got fish that are in that 6 to 10 inch range, making up the majority, that's a lot of fun, because on light tackle, you're going to have, just a ton of good plays of fish, especially the ones that are closer to 10 inches. You're really going to be able to tell the difference between a 6-inch fish and a 10-inch fish, the lighter your tackle is. But if you're new to the sport, if you got kids, family members, coworkers, friends, whoever you might be taking, and you just want to put them on fish, just a basic spin caster, if they're not comfortable throwing an open face spinning reel, 8 to 10 pound test, size 6 up to maybe size 10 Aberdeen type hooks, long shank. These aren't thick wire hooks. So a lot of the hooks that I'll use, I don't think I have any of my really small ones. But something like this that isn't as wide of a gap hook, if you're looking for a small hook, a really, really small hook to use for your bait, here's a little trout hook that I have rigged up, my size 16, and it's just a wide gap, short shank hook. Here is another size 16 hook. This might even be a size 18 hook, but it's not quite as wide of a gap. It's not the same type of hook. And the problem with this one right here is this is going to be great with the crappie nibble on it. But that hook right there is too small to put a piece of worm on. If you put a piece of worm on this, and even if you just try to thread it on there nicely, what'll end up happening is you're going to end up with a piece of worm on there that might look something like this, where you think that you're good. You've pinched it off. You've got just no overhang. You just got this little tiny chunk of worm that's on this hook. And I'm going to show you why this is not very good to use with a worm. So as you can see, we can't really find that hook point anymore. Now, I came loose from where I had it in there, but there we go. So you put your little chunk of worm on there and you're like, okay, great. I got my piece of worm on there. But notice how there's really no gap to the hook point. The hook point's right here. But the problem is even those little red worms, when they take it, they're not taking the bait off the hook. So when you go to set the hook, I'm pushing that into my finger pretty good, and I'm not breaking the skin because I don't have enough gap to bury that hook. So the smaller you get with the hook, especially these types where it's not a wide gap, it's more of just a traditional bait holding hook that isn't a wide gap. It's going to be a medium to small gap type hook. Even Aberdeen hooks aren't really considered a wide gap hook, but they certainly have a lot more room to work with, including the shank, to be able, and not a lot, there doesn't make a lot of difference. This hook is not much different than the other one that I have rigged up. It's just a shade less of a gap. And if you put a worm on that, you'll get bit. Your bobber will be going underwater all day long, and you just won't be setting the hook because you literally cannot physically set that hook back through the worm. So if you're going to elect for something really small like this, definitely crappie nibbles, because the crappie nibbles kind of dissolve in the water. They're easy to pull off of the hook, and they're not blocking as much, nor are they firm enough like worm skin can be. So right there, when you go to bury the hook in that, this crappie nibble is not going to provide any resistance like a worm would. So it's just going to either break straight off, or you have enough to actually bury the hook. But That is one thing that I found over the years of trying to get smaller and smaller and smaller of my hooks. I have like golden shiners in a lot of the ponds that I fish, and I like to catch them because they can get up to pretty decent sizes, like small trout, basically. They don't fight very hard, but they're good for bait. And I'll catch them on a crappie nibble. But the big thing with them is their mouths are so small that they really can't fit anything much more than that. But if you put a piece of worm on that, bobber goes under all day long, and just you can feel it pulling free of the fish's mouth because there's just not enough room of a gap to set the hook on. So that brings us through the bait portion of this. So if anybody's got any question on bait, go ahead and throw it in there now. We're going to move on to our artificials that you can use at this time of year to catch your panfish. Are the smallest squirm and squirt still too big for them? Okay, so we'll start with that because that's my favorite. That is my go-to. My Bass Pro Crappie Max Squirm and Squirt 1.5 inch tube on a 1/32 or a 1/64 ounce jig head. Those are perfect for sunfish. You could actually catch 4, 5, 6 inch sunfish on those baits. They do a lot more damage to them than bass and crappie do just by the nature of how they bite. So you will go through a lot more tubes, and you can go through them very quickly. I mean, you can lose a tube on the first fish because they've ripped so much out of it. Let me find an 1.5 inch. I got a lot of 2 inchers sitting here, but this is my pond box. This is all I take to ponds. I almost always exclusively use my tubes. I got some baby shad that I'll use for crappie. Sunfish will also take these. And then I got a couple of different options to rig up some stick worms and some bigger tubes for bass. But this is all I take. This is all you need. We're going to show a bunch of different artificial lures that you can use. But over the years of pond fishing, this is what I have the most confidence in right here in this box. I take it to every creek, river, and pond in the state, small lakes. And I always find success with this box. And it's just been years and years of trial and error, dialing down to just what works everywhere I go. There's certain places where I need to use a particular type of bait. I've never been to a place where this didn't do the job for me, or even better than what I was told was the go-to bait. So here's an 1.5 inch tube. This is on a 1/32 ounce jig head. Our hook point is pretty good. The big thing with panfish and crappie, we really want our hook point as close to the back of our bait as possible. The more plastic or bait, whatever your lure is, the more tail end there is to the hook point. You will still get bit all of the time. You will hook up very infrequently because it will take a big enough of a fish to inhale the back of that bait to get up to that hook point. So what happens with these tubes and sunfish is, like I said, they're quick strikers. They don't have the luxury to follow something in forever and take their time. If they want it, they got to come get it. So what happens is they will grab the backs of these, and these are pretty easy to rip off. So with sunfish, you're really lucky if you can get maybe 10 or 15 sunfish out of one tube. Not only will they rip the tentacles completely off of it, so you'll lose a few here and there, but you can have 2 tentacles left. That's still plenty. You're still going to get bit. As long as you got at least 1 tentacle back here flapping, you're going to continue to pick up fish. But what they'll also do is when they hit it and it kind of moves the soft plastic back, because this is internally rigged, they will break kind of a skull cap on the top, and it'll fillet this open, and it'll start to fall down. If it gives you enough of kind of a cap, almost like it almost becomes like a hoodie. So when it's up like this and it's on there, it rips the skin, and so it falls back behind the jig head. But as long as it leaves it intact, you can usually just pull that back up and over, even though it's cut. And depending on what your level of tolerance is for continuing to do that, because if you get bit and you don't hook up, it's going to pull it right back down. You catch a fish, odds are it's going to pull it right back down. So having a whole bunch of them rigged up and ready to go, so you can just unsnap or clip them off and retie. But these are the different hook sizes that I use with them. A 16th I almost never use in ponds. It's too much. It sinks too fast. I can't keep it up off the bottom. I like to fish these as slow as possible. I like to just kind of keep them moving. So when you can straight retrieve this, cast it straight out, and just reel in as slow as you can go without catching the bottom, catch fish all day long. I like to kind of reel them and then give them a little pop so they'll dart occasionally, pop up, but it's still part of a pretty steady retrieve. I'm just popping the rod while I'm doing it. But we've got our, where's the 132nd at? There we go. All right, so here's our 3 different hook sizes that are great for the 1.5 and 2-inch versions of any tube that you buy. If you buy any type of naturally colored tube like this in the 1.5 to 2-inch range, these are going to be great jig heads for you. So this is our 16th ounce on this end, our 32 ounce in the middle, and our 1/64th ounce over here on the end. These 1/32 and 1/64th, if you are using more than 6-pound test and more than a light or medium light action rod, you will get twists in your line because they are so light that unless you have a light action rod where you get the sensitivity of the tip and light enough line to be able to throw it, you might elect to start off with the 16th until you get comfortable with the 16th ounce weight, and then start to size down as you get more comfortable with the casting, because these are really light. Now they fly great on a fly rod, especially the 64th ounce. I will rig. This is a 2-inch tube. So the only difference between an 1.5 and a 2-inch tube is really just the tail. The body sizes are pretty much identical. You're just getting that little bit, that 1/2 inch extra of tail. I do not like that for sunfish because, like I said, the hook point is too far away, and that's just giving them way too much to grab onto and rip off. So I stay away from the 2-inch if I'm fishing for sunfish. These are great in creeks and rivers for bass, and even sunfish in a river because they're more willing to give a little bit of chase and try to inhale the bait. But when you're in a pond and they're just quick striking, you're going to lose all those tentacles and maybe only hook up 1 out of every 5 bites. Whereas with the 1/32 ounce or 1/64th on our 1.5 inch, you're probably looking at more of a 3 to 5, 4 to 5 bite hookup rate because they're able to get that hook point. But when you go to rig them, no matter what size you're using, Bass Pro makes, these are called a squirt head. They are intended to be used in these tubes. You can use a basic ball jig head in here. The tube's going to get ruined more often. The more air that's in there for the sunfish to be able to get down on their little sandpaper teeth, they'll just chew the tube in half after a few fish. So it's nice to get a jig head that's got lead or tungsten or whatever as far down the hook shank to the turn as possible. Because what that does is when you take them, take your eye guide and just put the eye guide, you kind of separate the tentacles, find a good opening, and then put that eye guide just right in the middle so that it's horizontal with your bait. And then just turn it in there and just work that soft plastic. Just push it up until you feel the that eyelid in the top come all the way up to the top of the bait. Then once you get up to the top and it looks like that, got our soft plastic. All you got to do to break the soft plastic to get the eyelid through, just a little bit of pressure, pops right out. Then you're internally rigged. But now when you grab the body of the bait, there's not an air pocket in there so you can feel the lead. So it doesn't give them as much wear and tear with a gap in there. So, but you can use you could use a jig head just like this to put into you could put this in a tube, no problem. It'll stuff right up in there as well. Same deal. You just push it up. And then typically what I do to get them on there is I'll take the little cone head and put the pressure on that and then work the hook so that I don't accidentally break through before I get to the top. And then you just pop your eye guide out. Can't tell the difference between the two. The only difference is this is all air down to the hook shank here. So you're just going to get your tube torn up quicker than you will. So you get a few extra bites, few extra fish, little more longevity out of your tube if you use a jig head that has weight on the shank as far down as it can go. But these are my go-to. If I had one recommendation of a panfish, crappie, even bass, I mean, I catch 5 and 6 pound bass on a 1/32 ounce, 1.5 inch in ponds. It's just, this is such a good overall bait, a tube, especially a small one, because with these tentacles on the back and with this color scheme, this green pumpkin with red flake in it, red and black flake, there's lots of argument over putting red flash in a bait, whether or not fish relate that to a wounded bait fish, or a wounded prey where there's blood. There's a lot of speculation over that. No, you're going to get different answers from different people. I don't know what it is, but this, with green pumpkin, especially this Bass Pro, every green pumpkin for every brand is a shade different. I've never found anything for creek and pond fishing that can outfish this from an artificial perspective. Catches every species. It is so good at mimicking as many different prey sources as possible, which is what you're trying to get out of an artificial lure. You are trying to mimic what those fish are seeing as their natural prey on a day-to-day basis. So that could be frogs, it could be tadpoles, it could be other fish, it could be insects that have come in the water, it could be lizards, it could be crayfish. This mimics all of those. This back on the end, this just does such a good job of imitating any type of prey source. So it's good year round, and it's good for just a multitude of species. So if you are looking to find a artificial lure that you can really get confidence in small bodies of water, ponds, small lakes, clear water creeks and streams, this is a great starting point. 1.5 inches on a 1/32 ounce or a 1/16 ounce jig, and just casting these out and figuring out how you like to fish them best. Now, with all of these soft plastics that we're going to show, you can fish these under a bobber. So you can cast a bobber straight out, let it hang below. All it's going to do is it's going to sit horizontal in the water like this. And this is just going to pulse as it sits still. And then you can do one reel crank or pull your rod tip and jig the bobber. So the bobber will do this and this will follow. So as it jigs, this will be in a prone position. This will jig, this will hop up, follow, and fall. And when it's sitting there on the fall, crappie, panfish, even bass will come up, and then your bobber will go underwater. So bobber jigging, you hear that a lot with crappie fishermen. Usually they're using either hair jigs or small baby shad or maybe even a minnow, but they'll jig the bobber. It just gives it a little bit of action. And in ponds that have a lot of ground or bottom vegetation, moss, if it's a clearer pond where you really get vegetative growth and it becomes too difficult to cast this and retrieve it, where before you're getting bit, you're getting hung up, you're finding weeds, then just put it on a bobber. You could even put it on a round bobber and put it down to what you think the strike zone is, where you're not going to get down in those weeds, and cast this straight out and just slowly retrieve. So your bobber is just going to kind of be waking across the water like this as it goes, and this will be following underneath it. And if you're just steadily retrieving it, you're going to feel the bite. You don't even need the bobber to go, because you have tension with the line. So that's a good way if you want to fish these around heavy bottom cover and vegetation. You can just put a bobber on, and you can do that with any of these soft plastics that we show. And it's a good way to catch panfish. I mean, sunfish act a lot like crappie other than how they bite, but they're typically in similar areas at this time of year. And floating an artificial lure underneath a bobber, especially because most of these soft plastics these days are impregnated with scent, salt. Fish will grab them and hold on to them. Plastic's so good, they feel somewhat lifelike, where a fish isn't just going to come grab it and drop it. So you get a second or two to set the hook, especially if you're not paying attention and it's on a bobber. Maybe you turn your head, bobber's gone. If you have enough time to be able to set the hook. But these are 100% my go-to. 1.5 inches, 1/32 ounce, 1/64 ounce jig head, Bass Pro, Squirm and Squirt, green pumpkin, red flake. Come in a few different sizes, but I like that 1.5 inches, especially for pond fishing, because you can go up to the 2-inch, you can go up to the 2 1/4 inch. All that's doing is eliminating fish that you could have caught that are a little bit smaller. You can catch real big fish on real small baits, but you can't catch real small fish on real big baits. So just kind of process of deduction there. Give yourself the most opportunities to catch as many fish as possible, and you will see the big fish start to come into that. Especially if when you're pan fishing, a lot of times you got to weed through a dozen or more of the 4 to 6, 7, 8-inch fish. But then once you've kind of worn them out, then you'll start seeing those bigger fish, or vice versa. Maybe all the big fish are pushed up and you're just catching 8 to 10 inch or 8 to 10 inch or 8 to 10 inch or 8 to 10 inch. Maybe you've caught 10 or 12 of them. And then all of a sudden you start catching the smaller and smaller and smaller ones just because of how they're oriented. But that's typically how it goes. You'll usually catch kind of the same size fish and they'll start getting bigger, or you'll start off on the big fish and they'll start getting smaller just in that kind of spawning area. Some of the other ones that are here in my pond box are different types of swim bait or baby shad. So baby shad are just a small, usually 1.5-inch profile bait with just a pulsing tail. Nothing on it. They just kind of kick. So when these are still in the water, you can see that it's pulsing just in my hand. Add a little bit of water to it. You can hold these still. Again, 1/32 ounce, 1/16 ounce, just a little round head bobber. Only important thing with these is when you go to rig them, there is a flat side and then there's a curved side. You always want your hook point coming out the flat side of these types of baits. So when you put your jig head on, you put that hook point dead center in the nose and you pull it in, and then you just work the soft plastic up the hook shank, pop that hook point out about mid back, and it comes out. So like this one right here, that's not the greatest. So we have more of a hang. We kind of want it to be flush. Comes with time of putting these on. If you wanted, you do it enough, you stop thinking about it where you're putting it on and pulling it out. You're going to be close enough to be fine. But if you need a little bit of help, you can always just hold the soft plastic up above the collar to the bottom of the round head and see where your hook point's at. So you see where your hook point is right here. So you can just hold the soft plastic right there, knowing that's where I want to come out of the back of the bait. So then when you go to put it on, you have a good stopping point. So you just work that hook point down to where your fingers were pinched and then pull that back on. And now we've got a little bit better flush on it. But that's what it should look like. It should be coming out of that flat side on the top. Chartreuse, always a great color. Can never go wrong with chartreuse in any water conditions. It's always going to get attention. If you have shiners, smaller bluegill, chartreuse is just a great color in Oklahoma. If you're unsure of, the pinks and the purples and the blues and the blacks, can never go wrong with chartreuse as your starting point for crappie or for sunfish. Either tubes, small curly tail grubs, but something in that 1.5 to 2-inch profile on no more than a 1/16 ounce jig head or weight, however you want to fish it, and 32nd ounce, and you can go all the way down to a 1/64. But chartreuse, this is called the bluegrass color. So just a little bit different. This one's going to do a good job of mimicking kind of your small sunfish, especially some of the colorful ones. If you're in eastern Oklahoma, you have a long ear or anything like that, you're gonna find success with these. But this is my pond box. This goes with me everywhere. This is all I ever need to catch bass, crappie, and sunfish. Anywhere that I go, I'm gonna use this. I even take this to the lake with me and usually do pretty well if I'm fishing like coves or marinas. I'll find success with this box. So some of our other soft plastics that we got going here, kind of more of the same in this box but there's a couple of different options. So this is kind of a panfish box. Most people would think of this as more of a crappie box, but this is all going to do good for sunfish. The only thing really different that's in these that weren't in the other box is these rib tubes. Now you can get these where they have just the straight octopus tentacles, or they sell the ones that these are called jokers, and they just have 3-ball and tentacle on them. So you get these little pulsing ball that are on the back that when they're in the water, they just give a little bit extra action. Or you can buy this same exact bait. It looks almost identical, but instead of just having the 3 thick tentacles that come off, it's going to be more of that hang like this. It's going to be more of like a skirt that comes down. But these are good. Blacks. So this is a black and red flake with this chartreuse. You're going to see them in what's called June bug. These are my 2 favorite colors. If I'm going to do something different, and these will catch some really big panfish, especially if you have the ability to maybe take a float tube or a kayak out and dead drift. That's what I love to do in a pond. I'll go right off of the dam or right off whatever the creek channel is, and whichever way the wind's blowing, I'll go to that end of the pond and just allow the wind to push me in a kayak, and I'll just hold the rod. I'll let it hit the bottom. So I'll drop it, I'll let it hit the bottom, I'll reel it up a foot, and then I will just hold on to the rod. You can put it in a rod holder and just dead drift. So this will just be pulsing along just like this. And I found some of the biggest sunfish that I've ever caught in ponds doing that with this type of bait, a ribbed either joker or a whole, but these are full body. So unlike the other tubes that are hollow body where you go up into them, this is one solid piece of plastic. So with these, the best way to rig these is, again, 16th ounce, a 1/32. Because if you're going to dead stick these or put these under a bobber, like, and I don't usually put these under a bobber. If I have a bobber in my hand, I typically have this on. The tubes, I feel comfortable. I like to work them back in, so I very rarely put a bobber on them. It's usually not necessary, but I will put a bobber on these, especially if the crappie are being a little finicky and they don't want to really give chase. They want it just to swing and stop. Then I have this on under a bobber. But with these, I love these for dead drifting. You can do it in a boat if you're out on the lake, or if you're in a kayak or a float tube. But with these, same thing as we did with the baby shad, go right in through the nose of the bait with the hook point. And with these, you can see the ribs on them. So this is molded plastic. So you want to keep your hook point away from where the chartreuse and the black come together, because that's where your bait has been molded together. So the rib that's right above it, the bulky rib, and then where the chartreuse is, there's going to be that little valley that's in there. That's where I want to bring the hook point out of. That's usually the perfect length to work this up where it's not mushed on there and it sits perfectly flush. And it comes out right in between. So it comes out right in that valley between the chartreuse, basically at the mold. But if you run it down into the mold, sometimes if it's not a really good mold, once you come through, you'll realize that the bait has cracked. So just something to pay attention to. Sometimes it happens and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just how they're molded. But really like these. So I've got them in that June bug color and then black and red, and then the chartreuse on the end. Love these. These are great for real big sunfish, especially on small bodies of water. If you can dead drift them out over channels, flats, just in a little bit of that deeper water that you have access to those bigger fish at this time of year. They will come up. You can catch them. You know, some of the biggest sunfish I've ever caught have been on the little tiny hook with just a crappie nibble. But some of the biggest ones I've ever caught have been on these, and I almost never use these. But when I do, I'm dead drifting in a kayak, and I'll catch some of the bigger sunfish out of a pond using these. Everything else that's in here, pretty standard. Here's a white one. I don't use a lot of white when I'm fishing. The only time I'm ever really using a white or a silver is when I'm on big water and I'm fishing for temperate bass species, even sometimes crappie, but very rarely am I ever using a white, especially in a small body of water or a pond. Now, if you use white and you catch fish, great. The whole purpose of these courses is to have you find something that you can relate to, that you can take, replicate, and find success with. Because once you find the success, you start building the confidence. It breaks you into trying other types of lures or another type of technique presentation. But before you ever switch over what you're doing with any species, find one bait, lure, time of year, place where you know that you can go back and replicate that success, because that's going to turn into success in other places for other species at different times of the year. But you got to start somewhere. That's why this is my safety valve. When all else fails, this is going on, and it always finds fish. And I always tell myself, why did I even bring anything else? So when you can get to that point with one bait, go with it and always have it with you. And then you start to expand into trying the other things. And, then maybe you start to build confidence into like a joker, into a full body tube or a swim bait or a grub, especially with that type of species. So here's another similar box, all baby shad, some different colors. But again, I would be sticking with these chartreuse ones up here. Maybe this black and blue. If you can find confidence in this, this is going to do a really good job of mimicking sunfish fry. So, those bigger sunfish, they will eat those. Then maybe like a red, kind of a red, yellow base, red, something like this. But lots of different options. Every single one in here is going to find fish. It's just which one do you get confident in that's going to find the most amount of fish the most amount of time. And for me, it's my tube. Other people I know, it's a curly tail grub. Some people like a little boot tail swim bait. Everybody finds that bait that they just fall in love with. They can replicate it. They can use it. So speaking of swim baits, that even though our little baby shad are technically swim baits, we don't really swim them because you use that pulsing tail where it's more of a kind of a dead stick, either from a bobber. And again, I will fish those baby shad just like I fish these tubes, which is as slow of a reel as I can go, which means I'm usually throwing a 32nd ounce or a 1/64th ounce, real slow fall, which means my reel speed, I'm just gliding it through the water. And I'm just subtly popping the rod tip as I'm reeling. So as I'm reeling in, it's just, you really can't even see it, but as I'm reeling, I'm just kind of doing this. Just not very much. It's literally just moving my wrist and you can see the rod, but that's giving the rod tip enough action that when this is in the water, it doesn't catch it on every single pop. So the reason that I'm just continuously popping it is when it does hit the slack, if I can find a good rhythm with it, every time that slack hits and then the rod pops, it just, instead of it gliding in just like this, it glides it in on more of an erratic, but still in line. And sometimes that's what it takes to just get fish that have either seen this a million times, they've been pressured, maybe they're not comfortable, maybe it's a really low pressure or high pressure day where they want to eat, but they're not comfortable. They don't want to give chase. Sometimes just that little bit of pop is enough to pick up a few extra bites here and then. But that's how I fish the baby shad and the tubes if I'm straight retrieving them in. Now, these types of swim baits, you don't need to do that. These ones are just straight cast out and let the bait do the work when you retrieve. So these are just little boot tail swim baits. So this little bumper back here does all the work for you. These come in 1/32nd, 1/16th ounce. This is a 1/16th ounce. This is a 1/32nd ounce. So just a little bit different head size on them, same bait profile. This is a great color. We got a little bit of white silver underbelly, but mainly a chartreuse body. You would cast these straight out and swim them in. Now, unlike your baby shad that have a pulsing tail, this is not something that you would want right below a bobber. Because when this is in the water, this boot is heavy enough and this plastic is firm enough. You might get a little bit of action out of that tail, but these are meant to be retrieved. They're really not meant to just still, because even though you might get a little wiggle, that it's just not as enticing to the fish as that pulsing tail. So these are great if you're not looking for more, if you're looking for more of a straightforward presentation as opposed to a finesse bobber jigging or slow retrieve and pop. You cast these straight out and reel them straight in. So lots of different brands make these. This is a VMC boot tail is the brand of it, but you're going to find these in just about every brand. They're going to either come, these come with the jig head on them. I'm not a huge fan of these jig heads. They don't have a bait clip on them. So what ends up happening is after a few fish, this starts to pull back, pulls away from the collar, gets the guts of it kind of worn out, and then it just sits. I can't ever get it to sit next to the jig head again. and these are fairly expensive when considered, all things being relative. It's like $4 for a 2-pack of these, where you can get a 4-pack of, or for $4 you can get a 20-pack of something else. So this is just a brand BMC, but this is what you're looking for if you want something to just straight cast and retrieve. A little 16th ounce, 32nd ounce boot tail in a 1.5, 2-inch profile. Cast them straight out, retrieve them in. You'll get bit on these all day. And this is the time of year that if you're out sun fishing, odds are you're going to find some crappie mixed in. Not shocking if you pick up a bass here or there fishing around those areas, especially if you're using small baits like this. Bass are coming in to look for fry on those beds. If you're throwing something out there that is in the right size profile of a baby fry, or maybe a smaller fish that's in that area, bass are going to hit those. So great multi-species time of year. If I was going for sunfish, this is a good one for crappie. Sunfish, they like that chartreuse not nearly as much as crappie do. So when you're looking at going after sunfish with these types of baits, you might elect to keep some chartreuse in it, but maybe go with a darker profile on the back. So give yourself maybe a black or a blue, something just to mix it in. For whatever reason, I've just found that sunfish don't straight go after the straight chartreuse all of the time. You will get plenty of fish on them, but when fish next to the tube, this is going to win every day of the week. These two fish next to each other, probably going to start getting a little bit closer bite just with this darker back. And then you give them something to shoot for with that chartreuse. But I don't think anything else in here. Maybe something that's just a basic minnow. You're going to catch something that's more of like a shad profile, dark back, silver body, something like that. You're going to find success with that. These would be really good in a bigger body of water, city lake, reservoir. You're going to get a lot of good bycatch with something that looks more natural, more of a minnow shad. You're going to find plenty of sunfish with these. It's the right bait profile to get bit by sunfish, but you'll pick up crappie, bass, white bass, maybe even a drum here or there with something in this color scheme, especially on the bigger water. So giving yourself a few options of some swim baits, some tubes, whether they be hollow bodied or whether they be the ribbed bodies that have kind of a brighter skirt with them. Those are all great choices. You're going to find a bunch of fish no matter where you go. Those are good confidence building baits. The last of kind of the confidence building soft plastics are going to be your curly tail grubs. Again, we're looking for a size profile that's so small. Oftentimes, even something like this that really looks like a small grub, it's not very big. It's not, you take the tail out of play because that's just our flasher. Your body is really not that much bigger than our tube, maybe by 3/4 of an inch bigger. But this right here is still getting on that fringe of you're going to pick up bigger sunfish with this for sure. But you're eliminating all of those 4, 6, maybe, an 8-inch fish can probably grab this, but your 4 to 6-inch fish, which make up a lion's share of the sunfish that you will catch, you're going to get bit for sure. You're going to be dragging this through the water and they're going to be just grabbing the back end of this thing. But when you put on a jig head, now you can use just a basic round ball jig head. When I'm fishing a grub, I really like to run a Roadrunner head with it. So you can find them in lots of different colors. The primary ones are going to be, you're going to see a white head with the silver flasher, or you're going to see a red head with the silver flasher. They make them in all different colors, but these are going to be the most common colors that you're going to see at most bait and tackle stores if you're not at a huge retailer like a Bass Pro or a Cabela's. You go to a local bait and tackle shop, Academy, a Walmart, these are going to be what you're going to see. So again, we're looking for a small size, a 16th ounce. I don't even know. You could probably order 32nd ounces specialty online, but typically in a box store, you're going to see them. You're lucky if you find them in a 16th. Most of the time you see 1/8 ounce, 1/4 ounce. It's just hard to find some of the smaller profile jig heads, especially the smaller the store is. But if you can find them 16th ounce, that's going to be perfect. With our grubs, all of our twin tail or our curly tail grubs are going to have a bend in the tail. So that tail is right on the seam. So when these are molded and pressed, there's a seam that comes right down one tail line and the seam that comes down the other tail line. So when you go and put these on, we want to go right through the nose like we've been doing through all of our other baits. You want to come right down that seam line and pop it out. Usually on a grub this size, I'm probably coming out in between the third and second rib in the crease. It's usually a good spot where it doesn't bunch up too bad, especially this one's got a pretty big collar on it. So that we got to work our bait up above this bait holding collar. And you get that up there, that's pretty good. Nice and flush. Not, you don't want it bunched up on there, but you also don't want it so far up where it's like, the bait's hanging down here. You really want your bait coming out, or your hook coming out of the bait right at the turn of the shank. If you can do that, that's the best it can fish. But you want the hook point, like your tail point, up on the top. Not to say you won't catch fish if it's tail side down. You catch more water when they're tail side up. So it gets more action. It straightens the tail out, because these don't look like this in the water. When they're swimming, this curls up like this. And you need that big curve on it. And why we want it upward is when that water is coming across, it catches it better when it's on the top to straighten it out like this. So when it goes through the water, it's just fluttering like a bait fish. It's just doing that, just back and forth. So when you can add a little bit of a flasher on it with it, just a little extra enticement. Again, these are great in the backs of coves on bigger bodies of water. In small ponds, you really don't need anything more than that hook and crappie nibbles, small tube, small little swim bait. You really don't. This is overkill in a pond, probably overkill in a small lake as well. You really don't need it. But if you get into the bigger water, bigger reservoirs, something like this is a good multi-purpose bait, kind of like the boot tail I showed in that shad pattern. You get out on that bigger water, there's more fish species. They can be in different places at so many different times. Using multi-purpose baits that will catch multi-species, the smaller you go to target your target species, which in this case is going to be a sunfish. So we want to be as small of a bait profile as we can get. But you can get a multi-purpose bait like this, especially in a natural color, a brown, a green pumpkin, a watermelon, just one of those natural colors. Green pumpkin just does such a great job of kind of blending the black and the tan brown that we see in so many different invertebrates, insects, all of that. Green pumpkin just really does a great job in the water of blending your two primary colors that you see the most often of prey species in the water, which are going to be tan to a tannish brown and then a blacker color. Green pumpkin is just that good happy medium. But something like this, this is probably even labeled green pumpkin for whatever brand it is. Some green pumpkin really gets more of that tan color. Other green pumpkins for brands are more of a watermelon color. This is really the color scheme that I'm looking for out of a green pumpkin. And it's getting a lot of light coming down, so it's really making it look more of a watermelon than it really is. It's a lot darker than what it looks like on the screen because the light's hitting it from up above. But this is kind of the green pumpkin that I'm looking for. But these are the colors that you're looking for no matter where you go. Just that natural blacks, browns, olive type colors. So a green pumpkin, a watermelon. Some may even be labeled as green. We don't have perch here. I know people call sunfish perch. There's a family of Percidae, which is walleye, saugeye, and then yellow perch. In a yellow perch, you've probably seen this type of pattern all over the place. Every bait shop you go to. If it's in a hard bait, it's usually labeled as fire tiger. But what it's imitating is a yellow perch. They exist naturally in the northern states. They've been stocked out west. They've been stocked out east. We don't have yellow perch in this state. They need a little bit colder water. They wouldn't do well here. They obtain lengths about the same size as what a big sunfish will get to. They can get up to 2, maybe even 3 pounds, but they're short. They get a big drop belly on them. They kind of just look like a mini walleye, and they're delicious. They're a great white fish to eat, but that's what a true perch is, and that's what this color is. So this is usually a good color to find fish no matter where you go, even if there aren't perch. But if you ever happen to be fishing up in the North Country, Minnesota, Wisconsin. They might even have perch in Kansas or Nebraska. That's far enough, cold enough water. But anywhere where there's yellow perch, a little soft plastic like this, match it with a ball jig head or a Roadrunner jig head. Good size profile, about that 2-inch class for our body. About 2 inches. So about 3-inch total profile of the bait. Really good size and a really good color. You can try this in Oklahoma. It's going to get bit. It's got lots of good colors in it. But anywhere where yellow perch exist, this is really what you're shooting for, because this is going to catch smallmouth bass. It's going to catch other yellow perch. It's going to catch walleye, pike, muskie. But that's the color scheme of an actual yellow perch. So I believe that brings us through all of my soft plastics. So not a lot. You're looking at curly tail grubs, little swim baits, tubes. Don't really need to get anything in or out of that realm for catching these fish. So our hard baits, which I very rarely use hard baits, if ever in a pond, especially subsurface hard baits. I might use a topwater bait. There's just, again, I have confidence in so many of these different soft plastics. They're cheaper, not as much problems with them getting snagged. You might get some weeds on them, but very rarely do you lose just a basic jig head in a pond unless you just get wrapped around a brush pile or a tree or something. But hard baits typically have treble hooks on them. Treble hooks can find anything, and sometimes getting the treble hook buried in weeds, depending on what pound test you have, is a death sentence for that lure coming back to you. But there are a few options that you can use, especially if you're in maybe a body of water that doesn't have a lot of vegetation. Maybe you are at the lake. You want a good multi-purpose hard bait that's going to catch sunfish, other types of panfish, bass, white bass, drum. There's plenty of good options, but again, we're looking for a size profile in that 1.5 inch, maybe up to 3 inches, but ideally 1.5 to 2 inch. So the first one would be just our super duper. Most people think of super dupers if they've even ever heard of them for trout, but they are a great bait fish mimicker. It's just a silver flasher or a gold flasher. With sunfish, you can probably use the gold and get bit more frequently than you might with a crappie may. So this is a 501. So they make a 500, a 501, and a 502. The 500 is like a 32nd ounce kind of range. This 501 is more of a 16th ounce range, and a 502, which is this next size up, this is going to be more of like an 8 in the 1/8 ounce range. They don't have an exact weight to them. They're labeled 500, 501, 502. I like the 501. It's a good happy medium. But this at a lake or in a creek, all you do is you just tie your main line onto this little half swivel. That's your eye guide, is the end of this little half swivel. So you tie directly onto that, cast it straight out, slow, steady retrieve. It's a half swivel, so it can't fully rotate. So all it does is it's just turning 180 degrees, not even 180 degrees, flashing through the water. That looks like every bait fish that we got. Just a silver flash, little shaved piece of metal. It's as basic as it gets, but these are great multi-purpose lures, especially in the backs of coves and big reservoirs, creeks. You may try them in a pond, but again, the treble hooks on the end, they're not very strong treble hooks. They can straighten out if you run them into some weeds, and especially if you don't have enough test to pull them back out, you're just going to snap your line. If you have heavy enough test to pull it back out, then more than likely you're just going to ruin the treble hook. These are the gold models. So here's a big 502 and then a 501. Sunfish kind of have a penchant for going after the gold flash more so than some of the other species like a crappie or a bass that really favor more of that silver flasher more often than not. But trout go crazy for the gold. I don't use the silver ones when I trout fish. I'll only use this 501 gold one is my go-to for trout fishing. But these are great for panfish. They will, your sunfish, they really like kind of that gold, bronze, tan color more so than the crappie will. So if you can get maybe a 500 version of this, which is more that 32nd ounce, and fish it, you can definitely drag these across sunfish beds and have plenty of success. You're just I just really don't like running treble hooks in small bodies of water, especially that have vegetation, laydowns, or logs that I may not know about or haven't found yet. So try to stay away from them. But super dupers are great because it's not a build bait and they're pretty light. So you can control the depth of them based on your retrieve speed. So it's not like a diving bait where no matter how slow you reel, it's still diving it down. That will take me to our other kind of depth control hard bait. So I would consider a super duper a depth control hard bait because I'm controlling the depth by my retrieve speed and how long I allow it to fall once it hits the water. Another one of those baits is going to be your Rooster Tails or an inline spinner bait. Lots of different brands. Rooster Tail is a brand, but most people like chatterbaits, rattle traps, even though they're brand names, kind of like Kleenex for tissue. We refer to most of these inline spinner baits as Rooster Tails. This is one of my favorites. It's a Vibrick Rooster Tail. It's got a little gold and green flasher on it. It's labeled as hammered frog most of the time, hammered frog or just frog, depending on if it's got a hammered blade on it or not. I love this color. It's labeled as frog. I consider this an olive. These are great in ponds, small bodies of water, even in the reservoir. Good multi-species bait. You can control your depth. Finding these, you can't find them in a 1/32, so a 1/16 is what you're going to be looking for. But these are great. So if you want to use something where you can straight cast and retrieve, feel a little bit of tension on your line because this inline blade creates that feeling that you have. So when you do get bit, it's a new sensation to the line as opposed to just kind of reeling slack and finesse fishing, and your line might shoot out in front of you. It might come back towards you. You might get the typical thump, thump, thump. With these, you either just get straight whacked from behind and there's no mistaking, or you get the prototypical thump, thump, thump as they're coming behind it and you set the hook. So this is a really good color. The other box has the better colors in them. But basically anything in this box is going to catch sunfish. But these are all pretty natural bases. We have some of our chartreuses and our oranges up here. I like the orange ones with the gold flashers for trout sometimes if they just, seem to be going after some brighter baits. But these brighter colors, these orange ones and these chartreuse ones, while they will catch sunfish, no doubt, these are great at this time of year for post-spawn crappie. Got our hook point all the way in the back of the bait. They're still kind of a fairly natural color scheme, but they're a brighter natural color scheme in the water. They draw a lot of attention, and crappie at this time of year, once they have spawned, those males will be taking care of their fry, providing parental care, and they will drill these, not because they're trying to eat them, but they just want that little flash going through. They're going to defend. But with Rooster Tails, your hook point is as far back on a bait as you can get. So when this is coming through the water, your hook point is all the way at the back of the bait. These are great for picking up post-spawn crappie, and they're great for sunfish because, again, hook point's in the back. Sunfish comes in to inhale it. These hooks are just small enough of a treble that they will be able to fit into that, that bluegill mouth. That's going to be able to suck that right in there. So really good size profile for a cast and retrieve lure. If you're looking for one, Rooster Tail is a really good option. And I would, can't go wrong with your basic natural colors, green, brown, black, white, with either a gold flasher or a silver flasher. But this is a good time of year to try out some of those brighter, more exotic colors, your bright neon oranges, your bright neon chartreuses, and kind of a mixture, a hybrid of the two. But again, great depth control bait, a 1/16 ounce. When it hits the water and you start to spin it, you are now in control of how far that's going to go down. And I like as slow of a retrieve as possible. So the first time I throw it out, I'm going to go as slow as I can. If I can get it all the way back to me without finding any type of bottom structure, vegetation, great. That's perfect. I don't need to change anything. If I'm starting to feel that I'm hitting the bottom or I'm finding where that weed line is, I'll pick up my retrieve speed just enough to get it up above that. And then that's where I'll stay at. But anytime you can run baits over grass flats, you're going to find good sized sunfish. They love just some nice thick moss, grass, especially if you add in some tree stumps, some submerged timber, boulders, any additional structure that you can add to any type of vegetative flat. That is where you're always going to find your biggest sunfish, no matter the body of water. So that, let's see, we got a couple more hard baits that you can kind of control the depth on. This is really getting kind of out into the fringe of what you should even look to use, but you can use spoons and cast masters. Again, they do a great job of just mimicking bait fish. You're probably more apt to find like a white bass or a crappie using these, especially if you're on a bigger body of water that has those species in them. But it's not to say that one of these smaller. The only problem with these cast masters and these spoons is finding a 16th ounce is hard. Usually an 1/8 of an ounce is a starting point. So you're having to reel it so fast, but just a basic piece of shaved metal, or, maybe if I had to choose between these two for sunfish, I'm going to go with this bronze one over the silver one. You use the silver one. This is going to be great for crappie and white bass, and you're going to have some crossover with sunfish hitting it. This one, you're probably going to get more sunfish coming after it than you're going to have crappie or white bass. And then if you were to go with the spoon, maybe like a burgundy and gold. But again, this is real fringe of you're going to get a lot of probably multi-species with these types of baits. They're really not necessary in small lakes or ponds, but if you have some spoons laying around in your tackle box and you want to try something, you will catch fish, and these are great. You cast them straight out. You can go through the more technical jigging a spoon or jigging a cast master, but they work just as good if you just slowly retrieve them and let them wobble. All right. We've got some little rattle traps, little lipless crankbaits. Again, probably going to get a lot of bycatch with these, especially if you're on the reservoir, but these are great for picking up crappie and white bass. An 1/8 ounce. So this is a Bill Lewis rattle trap. It is an 1/8 ounce, so they call it their tiny trap or mini trap is what it's labeled as. But it's just an 1/8 ounce. This is about as small as you're going to find your big time, your Strike King, your Bill Lewis that make a lipless. You're going to find them down to an 1/8 of an ounce. There are some specialty brands that are usually labeled as panfish lures, sunfish lures. You can find them in a little bit smaller, about the same size profile, but in a lighter weight. So a lot of the ponds I fish have golden shiners in them. So this is just a little 16th ounce lipless crankbait. I don't even know what brand it is. It might be Crew that I got it, but just a basic, came in like a panfish lure deal, but mimics the golden shiners I've got. And this is a good size profile. But again, we got the double trebles. A lot of the ponds I fish have lots of heavy bottom vegetation. So this is more of a go-to bait in the winter months. I can throw it out there, kind of run it along creek ledges and down in the basins and find some bigger sunfish with these. And then I'll find my bass and crappie, but not very big, from the knuckle to the tip of my finger, about little over an inch size profile. So great size profile, but these are good in reservoirs, or if you don't have a lot of vegetation in your pond, you could try it. You're going to get some really good bycatch. But if you're specifically targeting sunfish, if that is what you are trying to catch, you're going to be hard pressed to go away from a worm in a bobber, a crappie nibble in a bobber, or some type of naturally colored tube. Those just seem to be the most attractant that you're going to get of your artificial or your bait for just targeting sunfish. Now, if you fly fish, you can throw a lot of different bugs at them and have a lot of success. You can throw a float, you could throw your strike indicator a foot above any nymph you have in your box. Lightning bugs, Bloody Marys, pheasant tails, any of just your basic model size 14 to size 18 flies, you're going to have success. You throw those right on top of a bed, that bobber is going underwater. You can even cast those nymphs out and give them quick strips. You're going to get the nice tug of line of stripping a nymph back in. You can strip small woolly buggers. You can strip like Rubber-legged nymphs are really good, like a yellow Sally with the rubber legs on it. That's a great one. Or you can just slap the top of the water with a hopper, an ant, a caddis, a mayfly, just somewhere in that size 14 to size 18 class, and have a blast with light tackle fly equipment. 3-weight floating line, probably a 5 or a 6X leader, 5 or 6X tippet, super light line, throwing real small bugs. And you don't have to be as finesse as you are for trout. You can smack the water, you can strip nymphs, you can do all of the things that, if you've ever read a magazine or watched a fly fishing course or been taught or been with a guide, it's breaking all of the cardinal rules of trout fly fishing. You can do it for sunfish, and it's a ton of fun, especially if you have some good back casting areas. That's usually the biggest thing with fly fishing on a pond is, do you got a pond where you got a nice big runway behind you to be able to make? Otherwise, you got to be really good at roll casting, get your line out ahead of you, and then make those roll casts over. But you don't really have to worry about disturbing the water surface like you do with trout. The last of our hard baits are again, labeled as panfish baits most of the time, but just really small crankbaits. Different types that we got here. We got some Yozuri. These are pretty cool. They just have a single treble on them. They're real small. They're only meant to dive to about a foot. Again, you will find some pretty big aggressive sunfish, especially your like hybrid blue-green sunfish that we have that have a much bigger mouth on them. They'll definitely come attack these crankbaits. But colors, pretty broad color scheme. You can go with a red or a brown red, something that's kind of like a crawdad like this. This is going to pick up fish. This is another pretty good kind of crawfish color that's not quite as bright. I would probably elect, if I was choosing between the two, I would go with this one right here over this one. But these are two good ones, real small, not even to my knuckle. So this is really just about an inch profile. Great bait profile. You got this behind you. These float, so you only have to bring them down about a foot. You can normally keep them out of vegetation. So if you're looking to run a hard bait that you didn't want to just cast and retrieve, cast it way out there, reel it in, these ones you can work right along the bank because they're only going to dive down a foot. Give them a real slow retrieve, so they're just giving that kick and wobble. They all have rattles in there. You can hear the little banging of the ball that's inside, but they make these in every which different color. So here's one of that fire tiger color for a yellow perch, but you got a lot of sunfish in there. You got that dark banding, kind of some iridescent on the middle, some banding across the side. So this can mimic a lot of different fish. It doesn't have to mimic a yellow perch. So, and then if you're out on the lake, you might elect for, or a big reservoir, you might elect for more of a shad pattern, something like this. Just so you can get in on the multi-species. If you don't happen to be getting into sunfish like you'd like to, you'll pull white bass and largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, crappie with something like this. But lots of different options. You really can't go wrong when you get into the small crankbait sizes. Just have maybe one brightly colored one in some type of shad chartreuse pattern. And then all the other ones are going to be more earth tones, dark reds, dark browns. This is a good one. This is a sunfish. This one is apt to run into some big bass at this time of year. So I try to stay away when I'm fishing of throwing equipment that I know has a high likelihood of getting hit by a big bass, especially when I'm using 4-pound test, just because, even these little guys right here, these are fairly expensive. You're looking at $5 to $7 for just something like this. So that's why it's just not really advantageous to use hard baits when you're sun fishing, because the risk of losing equipment is great because you're typically fishing around some structure and cover. You're usually using a lighter line. You can buy so many packs of jig heads and plastics to, that you may only get 2 crankbaits out of that, but you can get, 200 different soft plastics and an assortment of jig heads to last you for all spring, all summer, even years if you don't fish that often. So it's always more pragmatic to either go couple worms or some crappie nibbles and hooks, or just some very basic soft plastics. That's gonna get the most return on investment that you're gonna make on any of your fishing equipment. But that brings us through all the baits. We got about 6-7 minutes left on this. Anybody got any questions that I can answer before we get out of here? It's Friday, beautiful weather outside. It's a great weekend to be fishing. This week has been dynamite. Basically, since we got that hot weather that moved in late last week, our low overnight temperatures have steadily been in the 60s, if not in some places the low 70s. Ponds, small water, even reservoirs, that brings up water temperatures super fast. So you're going to see in the smaller water right now a ton of crossover along the bank because crappie are way late. They wanted to spawn a month ago if they could. Water temps weren't there in most places. Some might have gone through the cycle. You always have fish that spawn early, spawn late, but that mass spawn of crappie really got pushed back this year, and it pushed it right on the fringe end of the water temps have come up so fast that now you have bass they want to spawn because it's even late in the year for bass. Crappie like to be end of March, early April when they can, kind of around that full moon cycle. White bass usually are the couple weeks before that. And we gradually work our way into the 50s and then into the 60s. This year, we were just hanging around 50 degrees of water temps. Some places might have been able to get up into that 55 range, especially down in the southeast. But really, in the last couple of weeks, we got rain, we got hot. Everything is like trying to go at the same time. So there's a lot of chaos of May this year fishing, which is fun because there's nothing better than being able to go out and have multi-species with the same baits. So when you're throwing a soft plastic that's like this and you're catching, 80-90% sunfish, 5-7% crappie, and 3% bass, there's a good chance that 3%, depending on how many fish you're catching, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bass maybe in an evening in the same area, odds are you might ding a couple really big ones. That's why I like throwing the tube. I throw it on a 6-pound fluorocarbon usually. I like, because of the way I fish it, I want to have good feel. I don't want you stretching the line, so I'll use a fluorocarbon. But monofilament's fine. But I'll use 6-pound test on a 6'6" medium light action rod, and I'll have my drag turned down pretty good, just in case I tag a big bass. That way I can play with the reel while I attempt to maneuver the fish. And a 5-6 pound bass is going to give every bit to that setup. I lose probably more than I land. I very rarely ever break off. I have my drag set good, so it's usually just them either straightening the hook out or throwing the hook. But that's how I'll target bass. But some of those hard baits I showed, it's the time of year where you can lose a lot of those. So try to limit the damage to your wallet if you can, because you really don't need more than about $3 or $4 worth of equipment to literally sunfish all summer long and have a blast. One of these, so this is a smaller one. This is probably going to run $2.99. With inflation right now, maybe $3.99. One of the bigger ones, $3.99 to $5.99, wherever you're at. There are hundreds, if not thousands, in these, and you're only using one at a time. Whereas a couple worms, you get 30 red worms, you get 12 to 18 night crawlers, and most people, they're pretty much done with the worms if they take them out there, especially with the way that it's hot out. Unless you're keeping them in a cooler, those worms are going to be nasty by the time you're done using them. So you're probably not getting any additional use out of them. So you're just, unless you're using all those worms, you're just wasting money. Whereas with this, these go right back home with you. You can use them again the next day. Pack of small hooks, it's going to cost you $2. A pack of split shot, a couple of bucks. And then you can just buy stick bobbers by themselves unless you go to a wholesaler, you typically don't find them in packs. So you're just buying singular bobbers. And the cheap ones, like these ones, that just got the little bit of styrofoam, you can buy the more expensive, like fill bobbers. Those are going to be like $1.99 a bobber, but you can get these for like 49 cents. All you need is 5 or 6 of these, one of these, and a pack of hooks, pack of split shot. You are good for sun fishing, unless you're fishing every day for the entire summer, probably for the next 2 years with just that equipment. And you're in and out of Walmart for under $10 to sunfish. So that is really all it takes, and probably, arguably, the most effective way to catch them. I catch a ton of fish on this, but I've been using these for a long time and I have a lot of confidence in that bait. But if I throw my daughter out with this right next to me, her bobber is going under every time it hits the water. So it really just comes down to who's hooking up more often. Am I able to bury this hook, or does this one win out? And more often than not, this one always wins out. So that's really all you need. You can take in all the other stuff, inventory it. It's great. They all have their place at different areas. And especially if you're on the bigger water, you're at a reservoir, it is more advantageous if you're not using bait to use a hard bait. Something that's going to make a little bit of noise, especially in stained water. It's a big surface area. There's lots of chaos going on in the water. When you're in a pond, small city lake, doesn't have engines, doesn't have anything more than just waterfowl, turtle disturbances on the surface, that's where you can't outfish soft plastics with hard baits, because this is just what they're looking for. They want soft, quiet, subtle, small. You get out into the bigger water, you just got a lot more species. There's a lot more disruption. You got to get the fish's attention. You want to mimic as much of a prey species as possible, which is typically going to be bait fish. So going with like a silver rattle trap, little 1/8 ounce rattle trap, maybe even a smaller one. If you can find a smaller one, like some of the ones I showed that are the panfish ones that are 1/16 ounce, great. Maybe a soft plastic mixed with a Roadrunner head. So you're still getting the flash of the hard bait, more of a hard kick sonic signature in the water with the blade, but you're getting the soft, subtle pulse that's more lifelike to an actual fish with the either swim bait or curly tail grub. But those are kind of the two major differences of fishing in the big water versus a more controlled environment in a creek or a pond. You're just trying to match what these fish are used to. And when you get out into the big water, lots of disruption. That's where hard baits are more advantageous more often than not to throw in coves, around points, sheltered water, than running something like this. This is still going to catch a ton of fish, but if the water's a little stained, if fish are just kind of moving and there's chaos and I can't just get right on top of them like I can in a pond, then I'm filtering a lot of water with this. Whereas when I'm making casts with the lipless crankbait, a small diving crankbait, a little Rooster Tail, a Roadrunner with the soft plastic, I'm getting more value out of that bait. I'm getting better bycatch just because I'm able to get a little bit more attention to my bait. But those are really the only key differences. The one thing that doesn't change, very rarely, in very few instances, will artificials outfish bait at this time of year. This is really the only time of year that you got a shot to outfish bait with an artificial for 95% of anglers out there. So never overlook your basic hook, crappie nibble, worm, kernel of corn, steam fresh corn. You got a bag that's got freezer burn. Go ahead and pop that thing in the microwave for a minute. Make sure you can nuke up the kernels. Just use a kernel of corn. Does the same exact thing as this. Makes a little bit more of a mess on your hands. But if you weren't using the corn anyways, or you got to chuck it, that's great bait for sunfish. It's just like this. Catch tons of fish on corn. So that's another bait option. Crickets, grasshoppers. You can try little pieces of hot dog, bread, Wonder Bread. You can ball up. If you take a piece of Wonder Bread, pull the crust off of it, chuck the crust out into the water as chum, get the fish going after that, get the scent in the water, then just rip off little pieces of your Wonder Bread, ball it up into a ball and kind of press it to where it becomes a whole piece. And then you can put that on a hook. That'll catch sunfish. That'll catch carp. That'll catch drum. So you have lots of different bait options when you get out there. I just try to use the ones that are the least messy if I can avoid it, and that keep the longest so that I'm not wasting money and bait by not utilizing it because, it got weathered. So with that, we're over time. If anybody's got any more questions, I don't think we do. We've gone the last 10 minutes without one. So I'm going to end this chat. We got a couple more coming up at the end of this month. We have non-game fish. So that's going to be talking about targeting river suckers, carp, drum, buffalo, gar, lots of cool different things in there, especially for gar fishing, showing how to tie rope lures to use. That's pretty cool. Catching, anytime you can catch a fish on a lure you tied is awesome. And then after that, that same week, that Friday, we have our Clearwater Streams fishing, wet wading fishing. That's my favorite clinic or course of the year. That's my bread and butter. I got a lot of cool stuff to share for that one. So if you got any interest in wet wading a Clearwater Stream in eastern Oklahoma for smallmouth bass this summer, that's the course to attend. You get a lot of good information out of that. So that's what we've got coming up. Stay safe out there. Best of luck fishing. No better time to be out than now. If you get the opportunity, take somebody new. We can't do this without you. It is your guys' participation that makes any of this possible. It's what keeps the resource. It's what keeps the lands. What keeps the public access. So participation is so important, even if it's just getting out there one day a year. That does so much more, has so much more of an impact than you can ever know just from going out and participating one day a year, where the dollars from Walmart or the bait shop, those excise taxes that come back into restoration funds that end up being the management, the habitat, the fish stockings, the fish management, the fishing piers, boat docks, boat ramps, all of that is paid for by you guys anytime that you buy fishing equipment. That's where that money goes. The excise tax that gets pulled off of that goes directly back into management. So without you guys participating, those resources are not what they are. So the more people participating, the better the resource becomes, the more money there is for access, fish management, fish stocking. It's just a great cycle of funds that goes around. And then obviously purchasing fishing and hunting licenses, that goes towards funding our agency and allowing state agencies to go out there and try to enhance and better the resource than when we found it and make it as great as we can for you guys. So appreciate you being here. You guys are fishing for Oklahoma. So anything that we can do to help, you have my contact information. Call me, text me, shoot me an email. If there's something you're curious about, you ever have fishing questions, if I don't know, I probably know the person I can get you to who does, or the direction to get you started in. Or if there's ever an Ask an Angler, if there's subject matter that we haven't touched on in the past, let us know. We're looking for new content to be able to showcase. So we try to hammer all of the bread and butter stuff, the sunfish and catfish and bass and crappie and all of that. But if there's any rigging technique or body of water or something like that that you're interested in, either myself or I can find a guest speaker to come in and help out with that. So anything that you guys need help with fishing, let us know and we will do our best to help you. So till next time, tight lines. We'll see you. Have fun out there.